I see no reason why Australia shouldn't join this great international movement of people forsaking the left, of saying identity politics, the cancel culture, high public spending, all the things that have gone with leftism in recent years, high taxation, the destruction of incentive for people who actually want to invest and create wealth. That people say, well, we've had enough of those days, we're going to stop. I don't see why it shouldn't happen in Australia, as it appears to be happening around the world.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. My name is Tom Switzer and I'm the Executive Director at CIS. We all know during the course of the last few years, best part of a decade, that progressives have shaped Western public discourse and institutionalised like what we critics have called a woke mentality. With its guilt about our Western cultural heritage, its embrace of green zealotry, and its penchant for cancelling unfashionable opinion, namely conservative and liberal. And around the universities of the English-speaking world, and this applies to Australia, there has been a concerted attempt to portray the British past as one of almost relentless evil. And as with all identity politics, the objective here has been to make the majority feel ashamed of itself. In recent times, however, something of a conservative tide has been travelling around the Western world. We all know about the United States catching this wave, as have Italy, and indeed most likely later this year, Germany and Canada. European centrists are floundering in the face of centre-right and populist right-wing parties. British Labour is sinking in the polls. And you could make the argument that the tide against wokery really started in, of all places, our part of the world, back in October 2023. Remember, back then, New Zealand voters kicked out a government and a cause adored by the global progressive left, while Australians resoundingly rejected a referendum that would have added race and its identity to the nation's constitution. And until recently, I think it's fair to say that no one, certainly none of the seasoned observers of Canberra politics, predicted that in 2025, the coalition could win power. But as it happens, both the Liberal and the National parties now have a decent chance of defeating a first-term government for the first time in nearly a century. So the question this evening is, how do we account for the changing political climate? Does this shift suggest that the progressive moment in global politics is over? Well, I can't think of a more distinguished scholar to address these issues than our guest here this evening, Simon Heffer. Simon is Professor of Modern History at the University of Buckingham, and he's a columnist at the UK Daily and Sunday Telegraph, and before that, the Daily Mail and The Spectator. Simon has been a past guest at CIS. He was our guest speaker in 2019, and he's the author of numerous CIS publications, most notably on identity politics and cancel culture. Simon is also the author of acclaimed books on the British Maverick MP, Enoch Powell, the composer, Vaughan Williams, historian, Thomas Carlyle, the English language, and a 4-volume social history of Great Britain from the mid-19th century until the beginning of World War II. Now, for mine, I believe that Simon has been one of the leading commentators in British politics for 4 decades. And with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome back to CIS Professor Simon Heffer.
Well, Tom, thank you for that marvellous introduction. And I'm very honoured that my old friend John Howard is here, greatest living Australian Prime Minister. It's a real thrill to see you again, John. I always feel you made only one mistake in your political career, and that was when you finished being Prime Minister of Australia, you didn't get on a plane and come and be Prime Minister of England. Maybe there's time yet, who knows? As Tom has indicated, I'm going to talk or try to talk about the currents of politics around the Western democracies. And while he is quite right to say that the first great national expression of resistance to identity politics and to the council culture for that matter was the voice referendum here in 2023, I want to point to a slightly less well-known example that happened a couple of years earlier at my alma mater, Cambridge University, because, as Thomas correctly said, much of what's gone wrong with the obsessions that people have with wokery begin in our universities. They begin with the indoctrination and brainwashing, particularly in the humanities, of students who think they've gone to university to have a proper education. There's a very brave man at Cambridge University called Professor Ahmed, who's a philosopher at King's College. And he, along with other dons at Cambridge University, was asked about 4 or 5 years ago, to agree to an amendment to the idea of freedom of speech in Cambridge University. The then Vice-Chancellor, who was a Canadian, asked that everybody respect the opinions of others. And Professor Ahmed quite correctly said, hang on a minute, other people's opinions are sometimes so ridiculous you can't possibly respect them. We can tolerate them, we can tolerate their expression, as we should, but we don't have to respect them. And the Vice-Chancellor lost, and Cambridge University struck a real blow for academic freedom, for freedom of speech, and for freedom of expression in saying all that. I certainly, if asked to respect the creed of Marxism, would probably die laughing. And yet I will tolerate others saying it because they are as entitled to their opinion as I am to mine. It was something that happened in the wake of the Black Lives Matter explosion around the world. Something I noted was led largely by white anarchists rather than by black people, but that's another matter. And I was really quite struck that it was also the culmination of years in which I had been aware in Great Britain that we had restricted our freedom of expression consciously, and that this had happened under a so-called Conservative government. The Conservative administration, by the way, that came in Britain in 2010, led by David Cameron, was then in a coalition. It ceased to be in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats from 2015 to 2024. But it's one of those rare occasions in history where a nominally Conservative government succeeds a nominally socialist one or Labour one, and is actually more left-wing than the government it succeeds. And that was certainly true during David Cameron's time. And what happened in my country, I think it's true of much of the Western world, certainly in the Anglosphere, and for all I know, around Western Europe, is that a bunch of politicians who were very interested in power but didn't really always understand how to exercise it, and who were not always terribly bright, allowed themselves to be manipulated by civil servants, a group of civil servants memorably termed the Blob by my friend Michael Gove, who was one of the few very distinguished ministers in that government. The Blob is left-wing. It has a view of the country that it is a country that is bad and needs to be changed, and it is instinctively anti-conservative. And unfortunately, I watched, along with my fellow countrymen, for 14 years, as one prime minister after another, we managed to get through 5 in those 14 years, took the country to the left and did so really under the influence of the civil service. There were many incidents where one heard of ministers being accused of bullying civil servants. 1 or 2 of them were true, but in others it was just a release of the frustration that those ministers felt that they could get nowhere with the civil service. But in my memory, when I first realized that there was this determination to close down freedom of speech in Britain, it predates that Conservative government. It goes back about 20 years to 2005. A British subject had been arrested in Malaysia for drug smuggling. There was no doubt about the facts. He had smuggled drugs, and quite a large quantity of them, sufficient to attract the death penalty. And he was going to be executed. And there was a great outcry from Britain that because we don't execute people in Britain, it was unthinkable that a British subject should be executed in Malaysia. Now, I thought this was deeply patronising. It was deeply colonialist. It's none of our business to tell a country such as Malaysia, which has its own customs and laws and practices and government, how to behave. They were once a colony, but that ended about 65 years ago. And I took exception to this. But I also wrote a piece saying, why are we so cocksure about the death penalty being a bad thing? Maybe you don't bring it in for drug smuggling, but for really vicious murders, premeditated, horrible murders, cowardly murders, brutal murders, wouldn't it be nice to be able to consider it again? Now, many of my readers agreed with it. It's a conservative newspaper, and many of them have never reconciled themselves to the abolition of capital punishment, which happened in Britain. Well, our last executions were in 1964. But one of the other columnists on the newspaper, who'd recently been recruited and was of the left, and I thought that was a good idea, I believe in newspapers being pluralist, resigned. He said he could not work for a newspaper that would allow one of its columnists to express the views that I'd expressed. Now, if I had advocated paedophilia or mass murder or something equally revolting, I would have expected the condemnation of colleagues. But I had simply asserted a view that I knew was shared by the vast majority of my readers, and indeed by the vast majority of the British public. Whenever we have an opinion poll on this, up to 70% of people would like the restoration of capital punishment. And I realized then that the left are incredibly censorious, that they believe in freedom of speech, provided the exercise of freedom of speech is to agree with them. The minute you stop agreeing with them or start saying things that they find remotely threatening, they don't like it. And what happened in Britain, and I think it's true of much of the Western world and the Western democracies, over the next 15 or 20 years, was that through the influence of the blob, politicians, whether the left or right notionally, agreed to certain changes. I mean, in Britain, famously, in the government, we started allowing civil servants and officials to put pronouns at the end of their emails and letters. There's been quite ridiculous discussion in Britain about when is a woman not a woman and when is a man not a man. I still haven't worked out the answer, by the way, and if anyone can, they might let me know. This was all done, as I say, with the connivance of the Conservative government, and also with the grudging acceptance of the British people, because I think, and perhaps it's true of the Australian people as well, they don't like having a confrontation. But the time always comes when that silent majority says, we have had enough. And it happened in Europe, I think first in Italy, when Giorgia Meloni was elected as Italy's leader. She came in on a promise to restrict illegal migration into her country. Italy, of course, being south of the Mediterranean and directly opposite North Africa, has had a terrible problem with people crossing the Mediterranean. And some of them stay there, many of them travel through Italy, travel through France, and end up in Britain. So the illegal migration problem is one across Italy. When Giorgia Meloni was standing for election, she was routinely described in international media as a fascist. Now she is apparently revered by most of her fellow heads of government in the European Union because her sensible, humane, but firm means of tackling illegal migration are seen to be succeeding. And indeed, they are now to an extent being copied in my own country. So things change. People wake up and realize that the views of a small leftist elite can be imposed on a vast populace for a certain amount of time. But in the end, those people see not their country so much being taken away from them, but their values being usurped and taken away from them, and they don't like it. This clearly happened in America last autumn at the presidential election. I'm not an unmitigated fan of Donald Trump. I fear that he did one or two things, particularly on the 6th of January 2021, which were simply not acceptable for a man who regards himself as a statesman. And I took no pleasure in that, and I don't accept any of the allegations that he really won that election. No one's yet brought any proof that he did, and I think there'll be a very long wait before they do. However, he manifestly tapped in his campaign in 2024 to the feelings of many people in America who had been ignored by a democratic presidency and a democratic government that took no interest in the realities of their lives and had nothing to offer other than rhetoric about what they might do to improve America. I remember seeing the spectre last summer of George Clooney going around. He was a very considerable actor, I don't take that away from him, but going around talking about the future of the Democratic Party and why it was essential that it won the ensuing election. And I wondered how this played in the Rust Belt. George Clooney metaphorically sitting by his swimming pool in Beverly Hills, telling people who have very little and who work very hard to get very little that they must support Kamala Harris, come what may. Any of you who, by the way, who saw Harris's various performances on television or on public stands during that campaign will be aware that in the words of a satirist, she employs only the word salad to get her ideas over. I found much of what she said not just meaningless but incomprehensible. So it's no wonder that many of her voters also took that view and decided to cast their vote for Donald Trump. And it's very interesting that Trump attracted support from black people and from Hispanics in quite large numbers, people who the Democratic Party told us absolutely would not vote for them. The problem I think the Democratic Party had was that over the preceding years, they'd done an awful lot of things like diversity, equality, and inclusion schemes. They'd done very little to control illegal migration into a country that isn't bursting at the seams. It's a big country, but does have problems in paying for what all these people need and accommodating them. And they had just lost faith in the Democratic Party. They didn't feel that party, in pursuing its own rather woke ideology, did anything for them. And so Trump, very easily this time, without any quibble or doubt, was elected. And of course, he has very quickly, he's now, I think, on the 23rd day or 24th day of his presidency, changed the face of America to the world. And he has had already an enormous effect. The British newspapers, shortly after I left Britain, showed endless pictures of criminals, illegal immigrants, being marched up the ramp into military aircraft to be flown off to Central and South America and deported. Funnily enough, 2 days ago, the British press showed pictures of a small number of deportees being marched onto a plane in, I think, at Heathrow Airport and being deported somewhere. We have in Britain at the moment, by the way, we think 1 million illegal immigrants. And Keir Starmer was very proud of the fact that since last July, he has deported, not personally, but with help of others, 19,000 of them. So it's a start, but there is a lot more to do. But there's no doubt in my mind that the publicity that Trump gave to his own deportations has put great pressure on the British government to do the same thing. And also, Trump has started to take on the diversity and equality and inclusion lobby in America and save a great deal of money. And certainly in my country, questions are already being asked very loudly. If he can do it, why can't we? Why do we need all this? And the most fundamental thing I think he's going to do, which is going to change policy right across Europe and possibly even here, if you get a Dutton administration, is his view of climate policy. Now, I'm not a scientist, and I don't know why the climate is changing. I know the climate in my country is changing. I've lived in the same part of England all my life, and I know in the spring the trees come into bloom about 2 weeks earlier than they did 50 years ago. And our winters have got markedly shorter, and we hardly ever see snow. We snow all the time. Now, climate is changing, but I don't know why. It may be down to man-made causes. It may be natural. Trump, as you know, has said he's going to drill more oil and help to advance America's prosperity by using this great natural resource that it's got. When he does pump all that oil and it floods the world markets, inevitably the price of petrol and diesel will go down. And when that happens, people in my country and elsewhere who are being badgered to buy electric cars will say, well, hang on a minute, when it's so cheap to fill up our cars with petrol and diesel, and given that you can go much further in a petrol or diesel car than in an electric car before having to charge it up, as it were, why do we need to bother? Also, Britain has this great resource in the North Sea still of oil and gas, and the government is very reluctant to grant licenses to drill it. We remain a nation built on coal, but as from last year, it's illegal to buy coal in Britain, standard coal. You can buy smokeless stuff at huge expense. So these economic pressures on Britain are going to tell quite quickly, and the fetish for climate change, which I've always thought was largely based in anti-capitalism, will have to be questioned. There's been a very amusing example of this since I came to Australia. Rachel Reeves, our rather hapless Chancellor of the Exchequer, whose budget last year, which was designed to advance the cause of working people, has so far achieved putting a great number of working people out of work, has decided to build a new runway at Heathrow Airport, because apparently that is the key to Britain's economic growth and advancement. Her colleague, the Environment Secretary, Ed Miliband, is opposed to this, but because he is, I don't know, possibly find it hard to get a job anywhere else, he said last weekend that he was going along with it because of collective responsibility. Those waiting for a resignation on principle may have quite a long wait. So they're already changing, they're already turning. And this is going to happen around the world. Canada is shortly going to have an election where it will elect a conservative government. In just over 10 days' time, Germany is having an election which will elect a conservative coalition. Part of that coalition, controversially, is going to be the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, who, like Giorgia Meloni, are regarded as fascists. We will see how they are tamed when they actually are shoring up a government and having to take responsible decisions. But again, the fact that people are prepared to vote for them in such large numbers suggests that the old social democrat left-wingery of Germany has extinguished itself. Germany, one of the great financial, economic powerhouses of Europe and bankroller of the European Union, is now very much on its uppers. And it is indicative of what happens when you go woke, you go broke. France is a very interesting case. They didn't have elections for 2 years. And many of you will remember old Jean-Marie Le Pen, who died recently, who I think probably genuinely did merit the term fascist. I interviewed Le Pen for the Daily Telegraph at the 2007 election. He was quite big news then. Although he was nearly 80, he was running for president again, and he got into the last two in 2002 because of divisions on the left in France. He'd been thrashed. Chirac won by 82% to 18%. But like the Algerian war paratrooper he was, Jean-Marie Le Pen was determined not to give up. And when I went to his palatial house just west of Paris, that had been given to him by a benefactor, by the way, I asked him whether he would prefer to be interviewed in English or French. I had no idea of his linguistic skills. And he said to me in French, Mr. Heffer, I only speak one word of English. And I said, what word is that, Monsieur Le Pen? And he said, whiskey. That would have been a very short interview. He was an old rogue. I mean, I said to him during the interview, many people in England think you're a racist. And he said, oh, no, all my best friends are Jews, all my best friends are Muslims, come on. I mean, it was flannel. But his daughter, Marine Le Pen, realized the toxicity of having those views in the modern world. And she took the Front National, as it was then called, progressively away from them, even to the point of expelling her own father from the party. And she renamed it the Rassemblement National. She urged, and with some success, Jews and Muslims to join it. Anybody who wanted a French identity for France. And she is currently waiting the outcome of a court case. She was accused of misappropriating funds from the European Union to campaign for her own party domestically. And the prosecutor in Paris has asked for her to be suspended from any form of public life for 5 years, including running for election in 2027. I confidently predict this. If she is barred from public life, and indeed her opponents do not want her to be barred from public life, they want a fair fight with her to their credit. Her right-hand man, Jourdain Bardella, will be the candidate, and I predict he will win because of her martyrdom. If she's allowed to run, I think she has a very good chance of winning because the rest of French politics is in disarray. And one reason it's in disarray, the left has imploded because it's following an agenda of such wokeness and also of such anti-Semitism. That's now a feature of the left around the world, that nobody particularly wants to vote for it. They had a sort of coalition between the extreme left and the slightly less extreme left, and that broke up last week when they couldn't agree on whether to vote against a budget or not. And France is definitely moving to the right. Germany is moving to the right. Italy has moved to the right. Austria has moved to the right. Romania had an election that the EU helped get cancelled because of electoral irregularities. It's being rerun in May. If the far-right candidate there, who's not a very nice man, he's a supporter of Vladimir Putin for a start, if he gets elected this time, then I don't know whether it can be cancelled again, whether the EU in its usual means will just say, keep rerunning this election until we get the result we want. That's what they used to do with referenda on European integration. Of course, you've got an election here, I believe possibly in April, and Mr. Albanese is not the most impressive prime minister on the planet, and I'm very keen not to libel him, and I think he's going to struggle to be returned to office. I believe if he doesn't get returned to office, he'll be the first one-term prime minister since about 1931. So that's going to be quite an achievement on his part. But I see no reason why Australia shouldn't join this great international movement of people forsaking the left, of saying identity politics, the council culture, high public spending, all the things that have gone with leftism in recent years, high taxation, the destruction of incentive for people who actually want to invest and create wealth. That people say, well, we've had enough of those days, we're going to stop. I don't see why it shouldn't happen in Australia, as it appears to be happening around the world. Again, with the great impetus of the world's leading superpower, America. The one country that, of course, sadly is left behind is my own. We had our election last July. People didn't vote for Keir Starmer in large numbers at all. He got 33% of the vote. It was a very low turnout, just about 59.8%, I think, from memory. And that meant that only 21% of people, just over 1 in 5, who had a vote, voted for the present government. Yet he won 411 seats. The Conservative Party only won 121 seats. And so they are a very small opposition. He keeps losing ministers. He keeps having to suspend people for racist and homophobic jokes on WhatsApp. He lost a minister this week for that, replacing him with a woman who believes it's feasible to identify as a llama. Takes all sorts to make a world, doesn't it? So we've got a crackpot government that's going down the drain. I can't remember. I've been writing about politics since the mid-1980s for the Telegraph and other publications. I can't remember a government that has imploded as fast as this one, coming from a different party from its predecessor, in the 40 years I've been writing about politics. They are so far down in the opinion polls, they need a periscope to see everybody else. And Starmer himself is digging a hole so deep for himself that I wouldn't be at all surprised if he came out in Sydney at some stage in the next few weeks. We've got to wait another 4 years, probably, before we have a general election. And the Labour Party, unlike the Tories, who are ruthless, has never replaced a leader while in government. They don't, in fact, they've never assassinated a leader in the way that the Tories routinely do in their history. Attlee retired. Poor old Ramsay MacDonald left the party. Poor old Hugh Gaitskell died. Wilson retired. Callaghan retired. Blair retired. They don't get rid of their leaders very easily. Starmer may be the first because the coalition that is the British Labour Party is against him. But what's really happened in Britain in the last 8 or 9 months since these people got elected is that my fellow countrymen and women have looked at the Labour government and thought, OK, we know why some of us, well, 3 in 5 of us went and voted in that election, and 1 in 5 of us went and voted for this government because we were so fed up with the utterly useless Conservative in name-only government that had preceded it. But these people are really, truly useless, and they cannot go on. And they are, as I say, seeing the lessons of other democracies around the world. They are seeing the need, at least, to talk about controlling migration. And Rachel Reeves is about to have a very severe test. There's a story in the paper today saying that her financial cushion, such as it was, is completely gone. And we are living beyond our means. And she's either going to have to put taxes up or she's going to have to cut public spending. And I think it will be the latter, because even she, I think, is not so stupid as to imagine that a further increase in taxes in Britain will do anything other than drive wealth creators out of the country in even larger numbers than they're leaving at the moment, and disincentivize people to take risks and work harder, just at a time when Britain needs to improve its productivity in order to get some degree of growth. So when she cuts public spending, that will be the last nail in the coffin, because she'll have to do it by cutting probably welfare spending. The welfare bill is enormous in Britain. There'll have to be an audit of public sector payroll, because the best way to cut public spending, as many of you are in business will know, is to cut payroll. And she'll have to do that. That will aggrieve the trade unionists. It will aggrieve her grassroots vote. And it will set the course for, I think, certain defeat in 2028 or 2029. The trouble is, as many of you will be aware, is we have 2 now centre-right parties in Britain. We have the Conservative Party, which under Kemi Badenoch has rediscovered its conservatism, and I have very high hopes of her as a Conservative leader. And we have the Reform Party under my old friend Nigel Farage, which stepped in to be the proper Conservative Party at the last election and to offer, as it turned out, millions of voters a chance to express their inherent conservatism. One of the unfairnesses of the British electoral system is that the Reform Party got far more votes than the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats got 72 seats and the Reform Party got 5. Opinion polls in the last few days have shown that if there were an election at the moment, the Reform Party would win, I think, more than 80 seats from the Labour Party, where they came second last year. And it's a very close-run thing. The poll that appeared last weekend showed the Conservative Party winning 178 seats, the Reform Party winning 175, and Labour winning 174. So that's from 411 at the moment. So there's an earthquake coming in British politics, and it's one that's going to be driven by what I've been talking about this evening, this motive force of getting rid of wokery, of the silent majority of voters in an electorate saying enough is enough. We just want someone to vote for who will do away with all this nonsense and just govern in our interests, not in the interests of a few minorities whom they suck up to and whose votes they court, but in the interests of the majority of people in a democracy who choose to vote for them. But thank you very much indeed for listening so patiently.
It's pretty self-evident that you're not a fan of Donald Trump, but you also acknowledge that his election represents a backlash against identity politics and cancel culture and whatnot. But let me put this to you. When Trump was president the first time, from early 2017 to early 2021, he did fight against identity politics and climate alarmism, if you like. And the result was that the left felt emboldened. They pushed back and they intensified their efforts on identity politics. Black Lives Matter, DEI, ESG, all of this. So the question here is there a danger that Trump, the polarizing figure that he is, he might make a bad situation worse, Simon?
There is a danger of that, but I think things are different in one respect, that America has just had 4 years of pretty awful Democratic Party rule, with Biden proving to be more and more incompetent and wasteful throughout that time, and quite clearly from the election result, alienating people that he would have considered a part of his core vote. So I don't think that the left will be easily emboldened this time by what Trump is doing. I think they've got to rebuild, and they could well be, if J.D. Vance is the candidate in 2028, it's too early to say, but if he is, and vice presidents often are, and he wins, we could be looking at another, 12 years in total at least of Republican Party rule. So the Democratic Party got a long way to go. What worries me about Trump is particularly his foreign policy, that he says things which are designed to just shock. But people aren't used to that around the world. It's not how you conduct diplomacy. This talk about Canada becoming the 51st state, this talk about evacuating 2 million people from Gaza and rebuilding it into a great big resort. This talk about annexing Greenland. This is all, it's all quite amusing, but one day he's going to be treated by the rest of the world as the boy who cried wolf. He doesn't follow through on these things. We were told when he was running his election campaign that he was going to solve the Ukraine problem on day 1. Well, it's now day 23 or something, 24, I think. And that hasn't been solved. So I think somebody needs to restrain him when talking about foreign affairs, because it is going to get him an international reputation for being, frankly, rather silly.
So in other words, Donald Trump, you're telling, is incapable of understatement.
He's very incapable of understatement.
But the first question, and we've got a roving mic.
In your opinion, is it possible for the Conservative Party and the Reform Party to do some kind of deal where they say, here's a whole bunch of seats, let's say in southeastern England, which are going to be, we're only going to have a Tory candidate, and here's a whole bunch of seats, let's say in northern England, we're only going to have a Reform candidate, and we're going to encourage Conservative voters, conservative in the generic sense, to vote either for the Reform candidate or for the Tory candidate. And then we are going to form a coalition, a centre-right coalition in government. Now, is that possible or not?
It's certainly not possible at the moment. In fact, in the British press this morning, both Kenny Badenoch and Nigel Farage have ruled it out. So it won't happen yet. I say we may be 4 years from an election, so who knows what will happen later on. We did have a referendum, by the way, in 2011, I think it was, on the alternative vote system, and it was heavily rejected. I mean, the first past the post system is far from perfect, as the last election illustrated. But I think in Britain, we have been through a long period of looking at European coalitions and how very dangerous they are and that they don't achieve very much. I mean, Italy during the 1970s had a new government every fortnight, more or less. No. And I think that they like to keep the system that they've got for that reason. Whether, when the time comes, there will be some sort of coalition, I somehow doubt. I can see the next election being fought by both parties. And I think that Kenny Badenoch's idea, let's say, I can't stress enough, although I have a lot of time for Rishi Sunak, I think he's a very honourable man. His predecessors in different ways were all very bad at their jobs, and they all failed conservatism quite profoundly in different ways. And the Reform Party was the Conservative Party at the last election, Mrs. Badenoch seems to want to reconservatise the Conservative Party. And if she does that, many of the people who used to vote for reform may come back to the Conservative Party. That's certainly her strategy. But a lot of people who supported the Reform Party were living in seats that were won by Labour and that the Conservatives can never win. So I can see what may happen next time is that the Conservatives will win more seats, Reform will win more seats, and they'll then have to have a conversation at the end of the process. We've been here before. It's a long time ago. Even I wasn't alive. It was 1910 when the then Liberal government had a huge majority in 1906 at that general election. It had 400 seats. The Conservatives had 157. In late 1909, the government was defeated on the budget. It was the first time the House of Lords had voted on a budget for 200 years. Asquith, the Prime Minister, called an election, and it was 272 for the Liberals and 271 for the Conservatives. There was no coalition, but Asquith went to the Irish National Party and said, right, what do you want? They had about 80 seats, I think. What do you want to support us? And John Redmond, their leader, said, I want a Home Rule Bill. And so they agreed to have a Home Rule Bill. So maybe that's what will have to happen between the Tories and Reform after the next election. There'll have to be a discussion about what each wants in order to sustain a government which could last for 5 years.
As it happens, yesterday, February 11, marks the 50th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher winning the Conservative Party leadership 50 years ago. Next question.
Yeah, my question is on the Muslim vote in the UK. I don't think you addressed that. We're seeing the problems there. I don't want to elaborate it too much. But also recently in Australia, we're seeing issues, obviously anti-Semitism, burning of synagogues, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just wondering what your view is on its seemingly increasing influence of the Muslim vote in the UK, and is that going to be reflected in Australia?
I don't know about the last of those. I don't know about Australia. At home, the Muslim vote as such doesn't seem to fall for any one party. I mean, many people from South Asia or people of South Asian heritage who live in Britain are people who are businessmen or women, and they're natural conservatives. And their family values are those of the Conservative Party as well. So it's not easy to say in Britain that they all vote for the Conservative Party or all vote for the Labour Party. Also, and I speak as a man I've got some very good Muslim friends, most Muslims in Britain have integrated, want to integrate, and love our country. There's a very small number who've been radicalised who don't and who want to cause trouble. Much of the anti-Semitism that has been visible since what happened in October 2023 in Israel has been engineered by white British students on the left. The left has now become the engine of anti-Semitism in Britain. When I was growing up 50 years ago, almost all the Labour almost all the Jews who were MPs were Labour MPs, and there were only one or two who were Conservatives. Now, I think most of the Jews who are MPs are Conservative MPs, and that's been the case for some time. And Jeremy Corbyn obviously had a tremendous problem. He himself didn't seem to like the Israel lobby very much, and he's to be seen on every march we have in London complaining about Israel and standing up for Gaza. I mean, the answer to your question is I don't know how far this is the work of organised Muslim radicals. I think it's more the work of organised left-wing radicals, some of whom may be Muslim, but most of whom appear to be white.
Simon, this goes beyond Israel and Muslim constituencies. This is recent polling research for UK Channel 4. It shows that 52% of Gen Z, so this is British Generation Z, these are people aged between 18 and 27, 52% support dictatorship. And they said, quote, the UK would be a better place if a strong leader was in charge who does not have to bother with parliament and elections. What do you make of those findings?
I think it's a terrible condemnation of the British education system. That people could get to the age of 18 or between 18 and 27 and not realize what dictatorship really means. I think it's absolutely shocking. And it really is a clarion call for our schools to start teaching history in a responsible way.
Well, here's another landmark YouGov poll of young British. This is for the Times, just yesterday, the London Times. Half of Generation Z think that, quote, Britain is a racist country. Only 41% of young people today were proud to be British, and only a tenth would risk their lives to defend it in a war. So how do you account for this deep erosion of faith in Britain among so many young people?
Well, I go back to the humanities departments of so many universities who see it as their job to condemn British values and the British past. And, young people are inculcated with an idea that everything Britain did in the world in the past, including the foundation of Australia, was somehow wicked.
We've been here before, though. February 1933, you've documented this in one of your books, the Oxford Union, the Debating Society, they passed a motion, quote, this house would not in any circumstances fight for king and country. So again, haven't younger generations in the past indulged in this madness?
Yes.
It's so different this time.
Well, what was different about the Oxford Union debate in 1933, first of all, the people who were doing that were a bunch of very privileged young toffs, all of them men, who had a certain view of the world. Had it been at Cambridge, they'd all be about to go and spy for the Soviet Union. I speak as a Cambridge man, and I apologize on behalf of my university. But also, to be fair to the young privileged toffs at Oxford in 1933, it was only 15 years after the Great War. Some of them will have had childhood memories of that war. Many of them will have lost a father or an uncle or a brother in that war. And the suffering that it inflicted on society, not just Britain, but on Australia as well, was very, very fresh in the memory. These young people have never suffered in that way. They don't have any idea. They have merely been poisoned to think that their country is not worth fighting for because its values are so shoddy. And I'm not a person of colour. I don't know whether my country is full of racists. In my everyday going around London, I don't see other people experiencing racism. It's been years since anybody called me ginger, maybe that's because I've gone blonde, I don't know. But we're not a nasty country. And if young people in my country feel that, I'm horrified. And again, there is something wrong with our education system, possibly also something wrong with the standard of our parenting.
But didn't we experience this in the late 60s and early 70s with the so-called counterculture, the height of the Vietnam War protests? And in this country, I'll just put this to you. This is Max Hastings, a former colleague of yours at the Daily Telegraph. He wrote a book on Vietnam, and he says that our commitment to Vietnam divided Australia more deeply than any other issues in its modern history, at times almost as painfully as the war that racked the US. And he gives this example, quote, after one infantryman was killed in Vietnam, protesters telephoned his parents and said he got what he deserved. So this shame and denigration of Western countries and our values, are we overstating how bad it is today, given that we've been here before?
Well, again, your country, my country wasn't involved, but your country was fighting in a war in 1968. And while I deplore what those protesters did to that poor man's family, there was a war going on, and tempers obviously rose. There's no war that's involving the young people of Britain today. No one's asking them to be conscripted to go and fight an enemy quite some thousands of miles away. It's just rampant self-indulgence, and it's born of an incapacity of thinking about what their country really is and what it really stands for and has stood for. And again, they're young people. They've depended on an education system to develop their minds to where they've got at the moment. And that education system, I fear, has failed.
Next question.
So you mentioned earlier that you began reporting in the mid-'80s, which was a really booming time again for conservatives. What do you believe? Have you found that there are similar circumstances happening now that was happening then? And what did the conservatives of that time fail to really capitalize on then that we can now capitalize on going forward?
Well, The two great conservative regimes of the 1980s were the one in Britain and Ronald Reagan in America. And although I once met the first President Bush, and he was a very charming and impressive man, but I don't think he was a brilliant president. And he left the way open for Bill Clinton to win in 1992. The Conservative administration of John Major that followed Margaret Thatcher was pretty poor, and it encountered serious division about its policies towards Europe. And it began, of course, with Britain's national humiliation in being thrown out of the European exchange rate mechanism in September 1992, because no one in the Treasury had realized that it was in a free market, it's impossible to fix the price of a currency, particularly to fix it at a ridiculously high rate. And so when a Conservative administration makes serious mistakes such as that, they get punished. And that lesson was not learned by the last Conservative administration in Britain, which made a lot of serious mistakes and got punished. I mean, notably, Liz Truss's 49-day episode as Prime Minister, which was a little short of catastrophic for the reputation of the Conservative Party as a party of sound economic management. So I think the main lesson that Conservatives can learn is to try and govern sensibly and responsibly. Be radical, but being radical is not the same as taking risks, and taking ill-judged risks, which I think is what happened in my country, both in the 90s and in recent years. That's your first question, which was about what were the great challenges, I think you said, facing the world in the 1980s. Well, again, both Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were trying to deal with the Soviet Union, which they could see was in steep decline. And they wanted to end the Cold War. They succeeded in that. I mean, the great triumph of that era of conservatives was the liberation of Eastern Europe, which is magnificent and is a monument to them to this day, and long may it remain so. Sadly, Russia has gone its own way and is now a rogue state and behaving quite abominably. And I don't know what easy answer there is to that, so long as Putin is in power.
Next question. Yes, at the back. John Connor. Yeah.
Yes, John Connor. One comment I'd make, and I'd like your response. There's a tendency to conflate classical liberalism with the right. In other words, to put conservatism with all its hues together with classical liberalism. Now, if you take, for instance, Trump, he is certainly not classically liberal.
No.
His economic policies are dirigiste and mercantilist.
Yeah.
And his most consistent basis for support are white fundamentalist Christians who have latterly become Christian nationalists, with whom most classical liberals would find little in common.
Yeah.
The same would be true in Germany of the Alternative für Deutschland, which I certainly, for one, I consider myself to be a more classical liberal, again, would find little in common.
Yeah.
So this distinction between the left and the right in this rather litmus test approach, to me, it doesn't get you very far. The other thing is that the makeup of, or the reason why people vote the way they did, let's say in America, I think is a great deal more complex than the woke and non-woke. To begin with, it's something of a myth that it was the Rust Belt or what have you that was the decisive figure giving Trump a 1.6%. That was the margin advantage. If you look at a breakdown, you'll turn it, I think, far more into large city against provincial, which doesn't necessarily equate on the provincial side, particularly certainly doesn't equate to much of what I would regard as being classical liberalism. So don't you think it's rather, to be frank, rather too facile a description to talk about the right in what's happening recently, as if there was some sort of unity to it all?
Well, you'll notice I didn't talk about classical liberalism in my presentation, and I'm well aware that the economic precepts of classical liberalism have nothing to do with Trump. They have nothing to do with Alternative für Deutschland. They have nothing to do with the Rassemblement National. in France. And they actually didn't have that much to do with the last Conservative government in Great Britain, which spent money like it was going out of fashion. So, I agree with you entirely on that. I think what I'm talking about is social conservatism. Interestingly, I recorded a podcast this afternoon with a colleague here about what you call the conflation between conservatism and classical liberalism. And of course, it dates back in my country to Gladstone, who began as a conservative, was instrumental in persuading Peel in 1846 to repeal the Corn Laws, which Peel only did with the help of the Liberal Party. And then Gladstone moved across to the Liberal Party. And in the 20th century, the influences on Mrs. Thatcher were profoundly from 19th century liberalism, the liberalism of Cobden and Bright, notably. Enoch Powell, of whom I wrote a biography 25 years ago or so, always claimed, he used to say, I was born a Tory. Well, certainly in social outlook, he was, but economically, he was born a Gladstonian liberal. And it was his belief in the economics of Mr. Gladstone that made him such a powerful influence over Keith Joseph, who was in turn a powerful influence over Mrs. Thatcher. And that's where the conflation comes. She was a social conservative, very much so, but she was a Gladstonian liberal in economic terms. And Kemi Badenoch, who is, as I say, is now the leader of the opposition, seems, I know her quite well and we've talked about this, seems to have a very Thatcherite view of economics. So that conflation is going to come again.
And Kemi Badenoch is your local member.
She is.
Next question. John Howard, the former Prime Minister. We'll wait for a mic.
Kemi Badenoch, can I ask you, do you think there's any possibility that the Conservative Party will reclaim for the elected members of Parliament the total and exclusive right to choose their leader? I mean, I think this current hybrid system where you reduce it to two and then throw it to the membership at large to make the choice is a terrible system. And when there are some people in Australia who want to do that with the Liberal Party, and the Labor Party sort of got a hybrid system, but they're they're not in opposition. I hope they will be. But the truth is that, and can I present the ultimate counterfactual? If the current Conservative Party method of choosing a leader had obtained in the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher may never have become leader, because throwing to the membership of the Conservative Party in the mid-1970s a choice between Thatcher on the one hand or Willie Whitelaw or Ted Heath on the other would almost certainly have produced, or not almost certainly, but very possibly, very likely have produced the outcome. Now, I got upbraided by a very highly respected Conservative figure for even raising that subject. Said, on the boat, he agreed with me, but he said, mate, you got no hope. The mob are never going to give that power back. And is any hope of getting it back?
Can I just say, for the avoidance of doubt, that I think it's an appalling system, because it's the people in Parliament who have to work with the leader, and they understand the leader far better than people at the grassroots. I am, though, pleased it got the result it did, because I think if anyone else had been elected leader of the party, they would not now necessarily be in office after 100 days, because the others were so divisive. And the division that was going on was not least why she got elected, because in the parliamentary vote, a group of men were so determined to stop her that they lent votes to each other, and she ended up winning because they lent too many votes. It just showed their idiocy, and it confirmed everything that one thinks about the intellectual calibre of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. I would very much like it to go back to being a vote in the party, and it's going to take a landslide victory at the next election and a leader to leave of, let's say, her own accord in some years' time, to bequeath a different system to the party. I can't see it happening any sooner than that, I'm afraid.
Next question.
You mentioned this tilting of France, Germany, France where I come from, Germany and other countries to the right, but you said no word about the European Union. And most of the woke policies that you so well described are enforced by the European Union. Of course, France and other countries have their own issues, but all of those policies are enforced, like immigration, DEI, etc., etc.
Yes.
So please, could you have a
Yeah.
word on that?
Well, as you know, sir, coming from Europe, the European Union is a profoundly anti-democratic bureaucracy that runs Europe. That's why when people say to me, why was I a Brexiteer? Why did I campaign to leave? Because it's allegedly so bad for my country. My answer was always, I believe in democracy. I like to be asked to vote for things that are imposed upon me. And the European Union, as you know, imposes things on all the 27 member states, 28 when we were a member, without any consultation, and we just have to like it or lump it. And I was fed up with being infantilized in that way, as were 52% of my fellow countrymen and women. And it's the bureaucracy, as in Britain, of the EU that is so woke. They grab every fashion and go along with it. And they are like the world's biggest HR department, if you like. It really is shocking. One thing I would say, I said to Tom earlier about fashions, I think woke is a fashion, and like all fashions, it will pass. And I think one reason, again, why our young people at the moment are so addicted to this and have these crackpot ideas that Tom described as being shown in this opinion poll, is they've grown up at a time, first of all, during a pandemic, where they were under house arrest for the best part of 2 years and didn't get out enough and talk to other people. And second, the whole Black Lives Matter thing, where people were taking the knee, and there was this hysterical overreaction to the murder of a black man. Now, I think we've all calmed down a bit. We've all got a sense of perspective. The young are very afraid to criticize each other because of peer pressure, and they're very afraid to have minds of their own. And that is something that the European Union bureaucracy, in one generation succeeding another, has capitalized upon during its existence now of over 60 years. I very much hope that things are going to change in the European Union, not least with the impoverishment of Germany and the possible election of our Rassemblement National president in France, that the EU is going to have to think about how it does things, how it finances things, and what it actually believes. I don't know that I would give the European Union more than about another 15 years.
Next question.
One of the big issues that took place in America in the election of President Trump was similar to things that are happening in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and possibly the UK, where there's a disconnect between the female vote and the male vote. Young men are moving to the right and women dominate on the left. So there's a recent poll that came out in Australia. It said women between 18 and 30, 32% of women in that age group are going to vote Green. That's who they're. So 1 in 3 women up to the age of 30 in Australia wants to vote for a far left party. I find that quite incredible. The young men are going in the other direction. They're going, in America, they went completely in the direction of Trump because they felt disenfranchised. Trump was able to reach these people through social media, YouTube, and a whole lot of areas, not legacy media. He ignored legacy media. He went into social media and he reached young men, and he got a very big change in the dynamic in America. Now, there is a very large disconnect between the male and female vote in Western liberal democracies, and women have gone further and further left, and men are going to the right.
So how do we account for this?
Well, how do we account for it in places like Australia and most of these countries is through the universities.
No, that's a question for Simon, though.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no.
I was just finishing my final point. So HR departments are controlled by women in major companies, and the universities are full of gender study courses and social courses, which you've elaborated on earlier on. I think this seems to be the driving factor where women are further and further to the left, and young men are going further to the right as they feel alienated. So over to you on your thoughts about gender in politics.
I'm not qualified to know what's going on in Australia. If you tell me that's what's happening here, then of course I believe you. It's not happening in my own country. In fact, women in Britain are furious with the Labour Party because the Labour Party has acted in a way about transgenderism that seems to remove the identity of women. And the prime advocate of this horror is J.K. Rowling, who has been, effectively cancelled. All those little creeps who made a fortune out of her acting in Harry Potter movies now disown her. They'd be nothing but for her. And she makes a point which many women I know, including my own wife, make, which is that if a man can just get up and say he's a woman, where does that leave people who are biologically born women? And the Labour Party at home, Keir Starmer struggled all through the campaign in trying to define a woman. Most of us would find it quite straightforward to define a woman. Keir Starmer couldn't. As I said earlier, he's just appointed a minister who thinks it's all right to identify yourself as a llama. So, these people are bonkers.
But Simon, given that and your earlier point that woke is a fashion that will pass, let me put this to you. This is your Telegraph colleague, Celia Walden, just in the last week. She warns that UK government-funded bodies are oblivious to the arguments you're making here this evening, and she refers to a police DEI reference guide to their officers and staff. This is in Britain, and among other things, it recommends that a pregnant person should be inserted into as many professional daily interactions as possible. So she paraphrases this and uses this as an example. Quote, "There's a pregnant person shoplifting in aisle 3. Can you describe the pregnant person holding the knife without mentioning their gender?" Now, this is manifest madness, but it's happening in Britain, and it goes against, in a way, what you're saying here tonight.
Well, I think it actually supports what I'm saying here tonight, because this is the blob. This is the Home Office in Britain who tell the police to say this rubbish. They invite... look, in the last 10 or 15 years, if you've wanted to become a chief constable in Britain and run a police force, you have to play this game. You have to go into the Home Office and say, my God, I love transgender people. I love black people. I love people of interesting sexualities, and so on and so forth. And you have to become craven to minorities and show that you've got a first-class honours degree in identity politics. It's nothing to do with policing, which I always thought was about preventing crime or catching criminals. It's got nothing to do with that. And they do this because the people who are the establishment of the Home Office have all swallowed this from sociologists and gender activists. They look and see what minority activists are up to and say, what can we learn from this? What should we be doing? And I say a succession of ministers in 14 of the last 15 years, Conservative ministers, have just gone along with it because they're too afraid to take them on, and in many cases too stupid to take them on. And that's really worrying.
Got time for at least one more question, maybe two. Any other questions here?
I was a policeman in Thames Valley and the Metropolitan Police for 10 years.
Yeah.
Most people I joined with have left.
Yes. I wasn't wrong, was I?
No, indeed not. But I was also, because I'm a glutton for punishment, a Church of England priest as well. And so the Conservative Party, the Church of England used to be called the Conservative Party at Prayer. My reflection is that it's now, well, in Australia we'd say the Green Party of Prayer, but certainly the Communists of Prayer, really.
Yeah.
And the Church of England's in a parlous state. They're about to shed off this terrible Archbishop of Canterbury. And we can all make fun of that. The question is this. The Church of England, or rather Christianity, was central to conservative thinking, thought. The Christian, I know I'm a dog with a bone on this, Tom, but the Christian church has receded. I've been here with Eamon Butler, who I asked a similar question to.
Adam Smith.
The Adam Smith Institute.
Yeah.
And not on his radar at all is the idea of the church, because the church, and I understand the Church of England has become an absolute joke. It's why I'm no longer a part of it. But classical liberalism, conservative thinking, Burkean conservatism, Gladstone, none of these things exist without the presence of the Christian message. And so I'm not asking you, how can the church re-evangelize people? That's a problem that I have and Bishop Richard has. But I am asking, where is that within conservatism today? That people who, you talked about traditional values or classical values, those are Christian values, but that's not on the agenda. Now, Trump's harnessed it in a way that's a bit not my style, but the questions around that.
I'm trying to think of a member of parliament, a conservative member of parliament, who has talked to me about his or her religion in the last 20 years. I mean, it just plays no part in their lives. And this is unfortunate. I mean, I live in a village in England, in Essex. And because of that, I'm well aware of the importance of the Church of England. It provides a great, I mean, aside what it might do theologically, it provides a great social service in the village, and it helps coordinate looking after a lot of elderly people in particular. And it's incredibly valuable. I don't think politicians at home of any party realise that. I don't know when the Church of England was last the Conservative Party at prayer. It was probably before the last war. I think really from the moment the Second World War broke out, it started going down the slope to extreme leftism that you've mentioned. And I mean, certainly my friends who are serious communicating members of the Church of England lost all hope when they saw Archbishop Welby celebrating Holy Communion on Easter Day in his kitchen. And I've got friends who are priests. They unanimously were outraged that they weren't allowed to open their churches during the pandemic at a time when people needed the comfort of religion. And it seemed absolutely mad to me, and I speak as an atheist, by the way, it seemed absolutely insane to me to do this. I, as someone who's instinctively a Gladstonian liberal, and Mr. Gladstone, of course, was a great devout Anglican, I do see the absolute importance of Christian ideals to the values of the society that I support. And even though I don't go to church on Sundays, I try and live by them. And I've tried to bring my children up in them. My wife does go to church, and she is quite serious about that sort of thing, so she needs no lessons from me on it. But I think a lot of people of my political persuasion do act in that way, and it's interesting that they do so without any help from the Church of England. Whether the Church of England will want to reconnect with the mainstream of British life, or whether it just wants to let anything go as it has, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years, will remain to be seen when we get a new Archbishop.
Simon is author of many books. His most recent one is called Scarcely English, an A to Z of assaults on our language. Our copies are available at our lobby. I'd like to now call on my colleague, Peter Curti. Peter is head of our culture program here at CIS, and I'd like to call on Peter to deliver the vote of thanks. Please welcome Peter Curti.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you very much, Simon. I think if there's a question that floats in the room tonight and that you set floating, it's this. Is this our country? Is this the country that we grew up in? Is this the country of which we are proud? What has happened to our country? We've touched on in the discussion questions about cost of living, about energy policy and the folly of pursuing net zero. We've also talked about the threat to national identity that many feel is posed by unregulated migration and illegal migration, as porous borders allow people to come into a country and then remain there, particularly in the United Kingdom, because of human rights legislation. And of course, we've touched on the issue of anti-Semitism. And I think that in many ways, the danger posed by the left to our society is focused very critically in the question of anti-Semitism. In this country, for the first time in living memory, many Jews are fearful of going about their lives, of pursuing their religious beliefs, of practicing their identity, of educating their children, of gathering in synagogues. And we've seen attacks on the Jewish way of life, which I think strikes at the Australian way of life. And I know that is a great concern for many of us. So it underpins this question of what is happening to our country. Simon, I'm very grateful to you, as we all are, for helping us to think through more clearly the way in which the character of political life in this country, in the United Kingdom, and countries in Europe has been changing. It's something that is it's a process that's underway. To what extent can we expect the defeat of woke? I don't know. There's a lot that yet has to be undone, but there are positive signs that woke is changing. At least the tide is receding, and we all hope that in fact it will continue to recede and leave a beach upon which we can walk. So, Simon, many thanks on behalf of us all at CIS for the lucid way in which you have expounded the issues and answered the questions and helped us to think very critically about what is, I think, a very important issue that strikes at the heart of life in an Anglophone country and in a Western country, such as Australia and such as the United Kingdom. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Professor Simon Heffer?
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.